Welcome back to another episode of the True Crime Show, featuring the most shocking killers in true crime history and the authors that have written about them. Now, on today's show, I'm about to be joined with my guest, Christian Barth. Now, Christian is a writer, attorney, and photographer who's originally from New Jersey. Now, his latest book, The Garden State Parkway Murders, is the harrowing story of the unsolved murders of Elizabeth Perry and Susan Davis. The two women were brutally knifed to death and their bodies left off the parkway in the early hours of May 30th, 1969. Christian Barth, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
I really, I feel you, man, because you've put 10 years into this book almost a decade to write this book. You did this with so much research, so much care. And people have no understanding how long it takes to put something like this together, do they? I mean, you put a lot of work into this book.
I did, but don't forget I'm an attorney, so I was working part-time. I'm a father, so these things did compete. It wasn't a full-time 10 years. It was actually longer if you really wanted to get into it. I mean, the research, the interest spans almost 20 years. The hardcore research is 10 years, is exactly right. Really... a long time. It adds up.
It does, and when you finished it, and it was brought by what your publisher's name is?
Wild Blue Press.
That's right. They are a fantastic publisher. I checked them out when I traced you down, and you really got with a good one there. They do some fantastic books, and they've got a really good book here. And it's a bit like giving birth, isn't it? Once you've done it, it's like wow. You did it. You saw it through. And so hats off to you because, I interview a lot of people and I know what it's like to have it published and everything else. So that's fantastic. And I'm sure you had a lot of people and there'll be more people to contact you about this particular murder. So I suppose the first question, I know you've been asked this a lot and we're going to get into some different angles as well, but what was the pinnacle part for you to write this book? What did you write it? And also just to give us a bit of a brief synopsis of the book as well.
Well, first, as far as a history of when the genesis of the book, when I was a boy, about 12, 13 years old, we'd always take trips to the Jersey Shore during the summertime. And I remember coming home, not arriving home one of these vacations, but traveling home. And I was about 12 and in the back car. I remember my father was driving, my mother was in the passenger seat, and we were going northbound on the Garden State Parkway, which is a rural road. And I'm from southern New Jersey and near Philadelphia. So it's very, very suburban, tennis courts, streets, no woods, other than the landscaping. So we were driving north home and I'd always look out the window and see just miles and miles of protected forest and woods and always wonder what went on. I remember being interrupted in one of these sort of reveries by my mother saying to my father, and I remember the words specifically, she said, "They never found out who killed those girls, did they?" And I remember thinking, just looking over and seeing we passed this point of the woods and thinking, boy, that's really fascinating. And it just really stayed with me. And I didn't think anything of it until about 1993 when I had read in the Philadelphia Inquirer an article that Ted Bundy, just before he died, had made a number of confessions. And these happened to be two of the murders he intimated at being involved in. And that's really what piqued my interest from there. I actually spent several years writing a fictionalized version of the Garden State Parkway Murders called The Origins of Infamy. And from there, I took it into the whole book. I was just so fascinated by the case and what happened. And one of the other reasons it took me so long to write is I just kept uncovering more and more material, which forced me to write more and more. It was a process of discovery as much as it was sitting down at the computer and doing all the work. So that's the genesis of how it happened. Now, as far as a brief synopsis, Susan Davis and Elizabeth Perry were friends at a college in Illinois. They drove from Illinois to the Jersey Shore to a town called Ocean City, a dry town, very wholesome. They went there and stayed at a boarding house for a couple of days. They were supposed to stay for 3 days. It was May 27th, 1969 when they arrived, and they were going to stay till May 30th, get some sun, Elizabeth was from Minnesota, had never been to the beach before. The plan was after the 3 days had ended, they were therefore going to go to thereafter going to go to Susan's house in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, with their parents and drive down to see Susan's older brother graduate from Duke University in North Carolina. By the 30th, May 30th was a Friday. Memorial Day that year was on a Friday. They got up ready to leave at 4:30 in the morning, and their landlord on the 9th Street boarding house that they were staying said, "You guys sure you want to leave this early? I mean, it's dark, it's night. Why don't you stay?" There's sort of the sense of foreboding. No, no, no. And their last words are, "There are two of us, and we'll be all right." So they went there across the bridges to a town called Summers Point, a very raucous party town, completely different from Ocean City. And there's a lot of bars there. There's Tony Mart's bar was there. That's actually where Eddie and the Cruisers, a cult film, was filmed. That's where the band with Robbie Robertson got their start. They were actually discovered there when they were known as Levon and the Hawks, or Levon and the Hawks. So they went into this diner, ate, no incidents happened. They left in Susan's car, which was a blue convertible. They drove 2 miles, and the rest of the book is basically what happened to them. A trooper drove by about 45 minutes after the coroner said they had eaten. He saw the blue Chevrolet convertible with the top down, called it in. It was mistakenly relayed to him as being abandoned. He had it towed, and then it was towed, and he didn't think anything of it, the trooper. He went ahead and left, and then Susan's parents started to worry because the kids didn't show up. They rented a helicopter. Helicopter came, and a search began about 3 days later. And once the trooper learned that the mistake had been made, and he came back from the fishing vacation, he said, "Wait, I saw that car. These girls aren't missing." And a guy named Elwood Fonts went in and found the bodies, and horrible stuff. And that's what happened.
Absolutely. And how far away were the bodies from the car?
The bodies were 200 feet in from the car, which was on the shoulder of the Garden State Parkway, the northbound, between mile marker 31.8 and 31.9. So that's where they were found, right in the side of the road, and just so nearby.
Gosh. And what sort of state were the bodies in? Because obviously it gets warm at that time. It was quite a warm time of year, wasn't it?
It was an exceptionally hot time of year. I don't know if you're familiar with the East Coast. It sort of has, as now, it's freezing, then all of a sudden it gets tropical. So it was unusually warm in the 90s, and that happened to accelerate the decomposition of the bodies. There was some animal infestation. Susan was found nude, face down, and Elizabeth, her friend, was found 10 feet away with all her clothes on except for her underwear. And they had been stabbed to death, beaten repeatedly. And again, the bodies were decomposed by the time they found them.
So the actual crime scene, it wasn't in the best conditions in a sense. With that
It wasn't.
No. And so one had her underwear off and the other was naked. I mean, and there was no suspicions, was there, of any sort of foul play from a sexual point of view?
Well, it's a very, very good question you bring up, Kevin. It goes into a whole other avenue. I'm certain that about serial killers, and I certainly did a lot of research and talked to several of them in preparation for this to get into their mindset of the Ted Bundys and so forth. And, there wasn't any, they still haven't been able to determine, because of the decomposition, whether there's any conventional sexual assault. There was, however, some other indications that the scene would suggest that, it was a sex crime, notwithstanding that.
Okay, yeah, that would play out right. And again, their possessions, they had high value possessions on them. None of that was taken. All the wallets.
None of it was taken. In fact, that piece of information I found out from one of Elizabeth's friends. She did have very expensive charm bracelet and I think a 1 or 2 carat diamond ring. These were very affluent girls. These were heirlooms that were on, and whoever did this didn't take anything. There was a few dollars left. So robbery obviously wasn't their motive or his motive.
No. And are the victims' families still alive in the sense of the parents for any of them, or?
No, they both set of parents passed away. Susan's parents died in 2016 within 2 months of one another. They'd made it to their 90s and didn't find out who did this to their daughter. Terrible. Mrs. Perry had passed. Elizabeth Perry's mother had passed away years ago. Her father lived till about around 2011, I believe, and he was very, very a family member I did interview. He never recovered from it. He never recovered from it.
No, and even if they had have found the perpetrator or perpetrators, um, they never do recover. Some of them, unfortunately, and that's a real horrible side effect of all this.
Yeah,
The victim recovery, people don't take that into account where they've got to go to the parole meetings. You know
yeah,
that the pain is as raw as though it happened the day before the parole meeting. It could be
yeah.
30 years after that, 37, 40 years. No, it's yeah, yeah. And did you get to speak to any of them?
I did. I spoke with Elizabeth's sister at length, yet several years ago, and you could really feel, the anguish in her voice. I did speak with Mr. Davis again a long time ago before I just about was about to publish The Origins of Infamy, and he chose not to speak on it publicly. Excuse me. Delightful guy, and the only other communication I had other than that one interview with Elizabeth's sister was sadly enough a not very nice email from one of the sisters. And even in that, you could feel the resonant rawness of her anguish.
And even with your sort of credibility behind you, with the sort of day job that you have as well, they would have known how you would be treating this with care and due diligence. Do you know what I mean? You only
Yeah,
want to try to get the answer. You're not trying to make a quick buck from it as well. But they just don't see it like that, do they? I mean, you sort of they can't understand your passion for wanting to try to bring some light to this. Um, but you've got to respect him, haven't you? I mean, no one can know what it's like for someone that's been through that. Do you know what I mean?
well, it's true. And I live with a person. She was in the news business for many years, and she said and she put it best. She said, "You have to understand. This is very raw for people. It's like ripping off a band-aid. They get the closure, and along comes Chris's book. And although it goes toward a greater aim, it nevertheless, I can understand why they wouldn't want to discuss it with either me or the press. I just happened to get lucky in one of the interviews.
Right. Well, I mean, that's great that you did get to, to have some feedback from them in a sense, and I know you've shared that in the book how they felt as well. Now, now we're going back to '69, aren't we? So was DNA even a thing in people's, where was DNA at that stage in a sense?
It wasn't a thing.
No.
I mean, I couldn't tell you where exactly the science of DNA as not Watson and Crick, but the fact that it gets connection to crime scenes. I did a lot of research as to where it's developed since that point, and even since the last. I did speak with, and the New Jersey State Police won't talk to me about it. It's an open investigation, but I did speak with one person, and he said they don't have anything. He said a couple years earlier they had gotten some NIS, I believe that's what it's called, some funding to do some more DNA tests, and the Perry Davis evidence was one of the things that they submitted, and they didn't find anything, which would again suggest that either the decomposition, excuse me, or that there was no conventional assault. I sort of lean towards the latter. I don't think there was a rape.
Yeah, yeah, and of course, the car's gone now, and
Right.
would you think the clothes that they were wearing are still somewhere, or?
Oh yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Right,
All
right.
that all that stuff's in Trenton in an evidence vault at the New Jersey State Police. Absolutely. They found a watch and they found Susan's eyeglasses, and presumably, Kevin, that they've kept the clothes. That stuff like that they never get rid of.
Sure. And now I wonder what the size of the task force was initially, and would you have any idea how small it is now?
It's a cold case, so periodically it allegedly gets reviewed. I don't know when the last time that was. It started out as an investigation of a manhunt is what it was. Once they determined that but they found the body so quickly once it was determined that the car had been missing, and it wasn't just them running out from home. It was 15 minutes between the time they started the hunt and found the bodies in the woods. So directly after that was when the investigation in earnest began, and that started off with a number of fabulous state detectives, several of whom I interviewed at length Several of whom have passed away in the past couple years, but I did get to speak with the main players.
Yeah, that's great that they've they gave you that option to speak to them, because some of them, well, some of them don't want to speak about some cases,
Yeah.
right? And you can have to respect that. But some of them, they do, and they're great when they want to work with you and help you out. So would you say what? So it's a review when it needs to be. So maybe just one or two cops when they review it, maybe, if that.
I spoke with some of the more recently retired guys. So these would be guys in their late 50s. They were retired at 50, and they reviewed it in the early 2000s. So I did speak with them, but at this point, though, Kevin, they only had sort of a compendium of it. They didn't go back and review, the entire thing, and they weren't there to do the groundwork, the interviewing of people, so they weren't able to formulate as large an opinion as some of the older guys were that I was fortunate enough to speak with.
Yeah, yeah, and these guys are very seasoned. They've seen a lot of murders, and the one thing they want is to try to, help the family get closure.
Yeah.
And obviously, if this was a serial killer, who was it? Is he still out there, or could it have been Ted Bundy? We'll get into that and some of the other names you've got. Now, there was a watch that was left at the crime scene as well.
There was a watch. The watch was called a Belfort Sea Diver, which was sold locally. For a while they didn't put the picture in the paper, but they finally did. And right before they put it in the paper, it was interesting. It was a diver's watch. It was sold locally at some stores, and I got a call years and years ago, a fax. You remember the old days of fax in my office from a woman who said, "I understand you're writing a book about this case. I know who killed these girls." And she told me the story of the guy she met in Florida at spring break in '69. His name was Ronnie Walden, a drifter from Florida, good-looking blonde guy, and met him. And she was having dinner with him and a couple friends down there, and sort of noticed a snippet of his violent outbursts. And she also noticed the watch, and she looked at the watch, and the watch said on the face 17 jewels. And she said, "That's weird. Why does a watch say jewels on it?" And once she learned the bodies had been found, she heard it on the radio, the discovery of the girls, and she had come back north to New Jersey. And she said her blood ran cold once she heard one of the girls had blonde hair, because this Ronnie kept saying, "I loved your blonde hair" in Florida. And he had driven up to visit her friend. So he was in New Jersey, in Atlantic City, near Ocean City at the time of the murders. And she had seen the watch. So she went to the state police barracks, and they kept asking her. They said, "Did you find anything? Did he notice, was this Ronnie Walden wearing any jewelry?" And she said, "No." And they kept asking her, jewelry. And they finally said, "Well, was he wearing a watch?" She said, "Yes." And she said, "Well, can you describe the watch?" They showed a picture. She's like, "That's it. That's the watch he was wearing." So they put an APB out, and Ronnie had left Atlanta, where he's living in Atlantic City at the time, and apparently stole a car and went to Colorado. So they found that he is in Colorado on auto theft charges. So the New Jersey State Police flew out 2 detectives to interview him. And get this, they go and interview him in the Glenwood Springs jail. And he goes there, and I think it was a couple hours before the state police were about to come interview him from New Jersey flying in, he tried to hang himself in his cell. I interviewed the jailer and said, this was no joke. This guy was blue lining or flat lining, whatever they call it. Rescued him. It was the same cell where Ted Bundy escaped from in 1977, going through the ceiling. I mean, coincidence? Is that strange or what? So that was what happened. But Ronnie, to the extent that, some people don't believe in lie detector tests, he took it and he passed it. And I don't know why they never pursued him anymore, but my friend that I became friendly with, the one who originally reached out to me and knew him, faxed me notes that were contemporaneous with her discussions with the police in '69. She kept them all these years. And the notes indicated that they found a half a fingerprint of Ronnie's on the girl's car, that he was a schizophrenic, had spent time in a mental hospital, and that they were 99 and 44/100% sure he did it. And she remembered that phrase because it was apparently Ivory Soap back then used to say in a jingle, "We're 99 and 44/100% pure." and that was used a lot. So that's how she remembered it. So despite all that evidence, he was let go, and he wound up spending an entire, rest of his life in jail.
Did you ever write to him?
No, what happened was I researched more. Again, I've gone off the deep end of this. In 1984, he was always in and out of jail. He was out of jail in South Carolina near Charleston, and he robbed a realtor. He'd go in and pretend he wanted to see properties, and then he would take the car and rob the guy and take him. So he wound up shooting the guy in the head during alleged botched robbery. They caught him after a long chase out in, believe it or not, I think Jackson Hole, Wyoming, brought him back, and he went to jail in South Carolina. In 1989, he stole a gun or smuggled into the jail, and he wound up keeping a guard hostage for 24 hours and with his gun, and let the hostage go. And they brought his brother in to try to talk him out of it, and he put his gun to his mouth and blew his brains out. So Ronnie's dead.
Whoa. Ah, wow. You can't make that up, can you? But wow. So it really could have been this man that committed these two murders.
Yeah, and then I talked to another woman a couple years later who had gone out on a date with him. It's one of those things where I was literally looking for houses along this rural section of the Parkway. If you look on the Google Maps, you look down, you can see their names and addresses. By chance, I called this woman, and she said, "Oh, that case, I know it real well. I went out with this guy, and I know he did it. Who was it?" She's like, he was from Georgia. I'm like, "Was it Ronnie Walden?" She's like, "That's him." He was, well, during that time where he was seeing my friend's friend when he was up here, she went out on a date with him, and she said he pulled over on the motorcycle to a part in the woods and stopped there and just scanned the woods. For no reason, he pulled over, and she remembers. Women have this sense. They just seem to know when something's wrong better than men do. They're born with this. And she said, "I just had the feeling this guy's going to kill me." And she didn't know anything about, his involvement in this and whatnot. It wasn't until years later. Actually, it wasn't years later. It was right after she had told the police about this guy that they interviewed her as well, and she relayed to them her suspicions about Ronnie. So.
Oh man, yeah, and to have half a fingerprint there that matched, I mean, that says everything.
Yeah.
What the hell was that doing on the car?
I know. Well, that's what she said, and everything. She's a very credible person, and these were her notes contemporaneous. She also had an inventory list of the things down in Fort Lauderdale that was in this house where he was staying with a bunch of people, and there was a knife there. So there was a diving suit, a skin diver suit. Don't forget the watch was a skin diving watch. So a mountain of circumstantial evidence pointing towards Ronnie, but they were never able to, I think, because they just dismissed him too early when they interviewed him in '69 after he passed a lie detector test. They just went on to other people.
Well, what's your feelings with your type of job that you do? What's your feeling on the lie detector test? Can it be faked?
I don't know. I've always wanted to take one. People, every detective I've talked to, when I tell them about, so-and-so flunked the lie detector test, they're very dismissive of it. And they say, well, anyone can beat a lie detector test. Sociopaths are experts at beating a lie detector test. And Ronnie was a sociopath. All these guys are. So it's a matter of getting them in the right, tripping them up on the right question. But I don't really have an opinion. I've never had to submit to one. I don't know anyone who's taken one. I've really only read about it in the context of these cases and persons who have been arrested.
Sure, but as you said, a lot of the well-seasoned cops that you spoke to sort of dismissed that straight away. Which, it'd be great to interview someone that does that job for a living, and wow. So, okay, so where obviously you talk about Ted Bundy as well in this book, in a sense. Where does Ted Bundy potentially come into this then, if you've got such a strong case against Ronnie?
Okay, well, there's another guy, but we'll get to him. Okay, so Ron, we won't go chronological. We'll go. So two times in 1986 and then 1989. 1986, Ted Bundy was about to be executed. He got off. He spoke with a gentleman named Art Norman, who was a psychologist on death row, and he said to Art Norman, words to the effect of, and he was speaking in the third person. He didn't have a lot to do. He had just finished school. It was 1969. So he went to the Jersey Shore, hung out on the beach, and met a couple of girls. And it wound up being the first time that he did it. And he felt this sense of taboo, of despair, this being the first time. So this Art Norman sits on these notes because he didn't want to violate the Hippocratic Oath, so to speak. In 1989, one day before Ted Bundy is executed, he is speaking with Dorothy Lewis, a criminologist. The second to last interview he gives, and she says, "Ted, you can talk about anything you want to talk about." And without any solicitation whatsoever, he starts talking about Ocean City, New Jersey, and says, "It was 1969. I was in Ocean City, New Jersey, walking around the boardwalk of this downtown area. And this is the first time I tried to abduct a woman, but she escaped. So I want to make sure that you don't think this is the first time I did it." But he didn't necessarily say I didn't kill anyone, or maybe he did. But I thought those words were interesting because why would he bring up Ocean City, New Jersey? No one knew any connection to him. Well, I found out after interviewing Ted's aunt, who lived in Pennsylvania, because in 1969, Bundy was attending Temple University. His family was from Philadelphia, or part of it. He was attending Temple University in Philadelphia, staying with the aunt nearby, and that lined up with the fact that there were not only to what he said in 1986 to Art Norman, but to what he said to Dorothy Lewis. So that's sort of how it lines up. And then I found out from the aunt, and Ted never mentioned this in either interview or anywhere on the record, that they had a house in Ocean City on 26th Street, which is a few blocks from where the girls were last seen and where they had stayed. If you look online, there's a picture of young Ted, about 4, in Ocean City on the beach with the fishing pier in the background with his grandfather, Samuel Cowell. So he did spend time in Ocean City. He simply never mentioned it during the interviews. I was the first to find that out and write about it. So I think to the extent that serial killers scope their grounds and like to familiarize themselves with where they're going to kill people, he certainly had ample opportunity to do so.
Absolutely. I actually interviewed someone that's done the encyclopedia on Ted, Kevin M. Sullivan.
Kevin.
Yeah, I don't know if you've spoken to him in your research.
Yeah, I know Kevin.
Oh, yeah. What does he make of the connection at all? I mean,
well, Kevin and I understand one another. Kevin he does the comprehensive Bundy from a certain point forward. I take him from birth, even farther back than birth, to the Philadelphia, and that's my expertise. So he doesn't really have much to say because this is all coming to him recently. My book came out and he and I have spoken. And he's like, wow, he doesn't think that Bundy was involved, but he also didn't know when he had written the book that these things that I put forth in mind, that Bundy had a history of being down there. But the whole MO was different as to how these girls killed. Ted would typically, feign he was being hurt, wear a cast, and club girls, women over the head, incapacitate them, and then take them to a different location. So Kevin is of the opinion that, as I said, he is convinced that they did it. But again, this opinion is all before that I introduced him to the whole. He had a family down there, so
yeah, absolutely. And to speak to Ted's aunt, that was an incredible connection that you got there, because you got it from the horse's mouth in a sense. Do you know what I mean?
Exactly.
Yeah. What does your gut feeling tell you? Do you think it's possible, or do you think maybe as you've gone on this journey that it's less likely now?
Well, here's the other part. I almost call it the 6 degrees of serial killers, because when Ted was in jail during the 80s on death row, he was next to a guy named Gerald Stano. Gerald Stano murdered 33 women in Florida in the 80s. Gerald, as it turns out, lived in the Philadelphia area in Norristown in 1969. Gerald confessed to the Parkway murders in 1982, or 80 or 82. Gerald, again, lived a couple miles from Ted in 69, so you almost wonder if while they're on death row, they talked about it. Gerald signed a confession to the Parkway murders, and Gerald was friends with one of the prime suspects in the Garden State Parkway murders, so they were acquaintances growing up, a guy named Mark Thomas. In the first days of the investigation in 1969, the police got a tip, from Philadelphia that a clothing store clerk had overheard a tall kid wearing a yellow shirt talking about the murders to a couple girls. They found him, brought him over to the police station, the Philadelphia police station, the headquarters over on 8th Street. He winds up giving fuzzy answers, quote unquote, to a lie detector test, but they don't have jurisdiction. So they call the New Jersey State Police, who spend all night with the guy, this Mark Thomas. The next morning, this kid agrees to join them over to go to New Jersey and take some more lie detector tests. So you wonder, look, if this kid killed 2 girls, he wouldn't be joining the police and agreeing to consent when he was free to go. He went over there. The police, his parents found out, lawyered up. He left. They continued to track this guy, this Mark Thomas. Mark would go on to become head of the Pennsylvania Ku Klux Klan, head of the national chaplain of the Ku Klux Klan. He formed a group called the Aryan Republican Army, which spearheaded a bunch of robberies in the Midwest, called the Midwest bank robberies, where these guys would take all this money and the proceeds and funnel it to his racist farm in Pennsylvania, where he would hold Nazi rallies and so forth. After he wound up pleading, and the police came in, he was a massive figure. He was on Geraldo. He was on Maury Povich, all the shows. Gabby Carteris, who's head of SAG, interviewed him, and people armed, neo-Nazis calling her a Jew. I'm going to turn you into a lampshade. Dark stuff. So Mark winds up courting this publicity while he's still an alleged person of interest in the 69 Parkway murders, which I always found fascinating. Okay, he winds up going to jail for conspiracy to commit bank robbery for 8 years, gets out, hasn't completely been eliminated as a person of interest. But I've always felt that it wasn't him, because I always felt it fed his narcissistic personality disorder to have this attention put on him. But I then found out that he was acquaintances with Gerald Stano, who lived next to Ted Bundy, who had the house in Ocean City. He was friends with Gerald Stano, and I learned from the Whitpain Township Police Department in Pennsylvania that Gerald's younger brother, Roger, who passed away in 2016, was in fact in Ocean City at the time of the murders, and the New Jersey State Police questioned him, and he was much closer with Mark Thomas. So you've got this intricate web of people that are involved here. Everyone just seems to connect in a way.
Oh gosh, yeah. Oh my God, why would someone do such a thing as admit to, doing such a heinous act and wanting the publicity for it? But there's bigger things going on inside. Was going on inside his head at the time. No, just remind us of the guy's name that was cellmates in, sort of next to Bundy that you just mentioned.
Gerald Stano.
Stano, yeah. Did you ever speak to Stano?
He was executed in 1993. I want to say it could be 1998. It was after Ted was executed. Gerald was put to death, and he had always said his confessions were coerced and so forth. So I didn't get a chance to speak with him. I spoke with the detectives who had interviewed him at length and interrogated him and so forth, but not him himself.
What does a detective do with that when, someone's saying, they did it, and you've kind of, as much as you want a confession, right, for so many reasons, but if, coerced confessions, it happens a lot, doesn't it, in a sense?
Well, that's what happened there. They actually, Detective Mulholland and Detective Kinzer from the state police went to Daytona Beach because they had gotten indication from the chief of police, Paul Crow, that Gerald had made these confessions to the Garden State Parkway murders. They flew down there, and Detective Mulholland told me that he wasn't buying any of it because they gave a lot of false leads. Was he wearing a blue shirt, making stuff up, and they felt that Gerald was being fed information, and they didn't believe any of it. So they left there completely unconvinced that Gerald had done it. But, the crime scene at the Garden State Parkway was interesting in that the girls were covered in sticks. And that was something that Gerald Stano did all the time. Detective Crow I interviewed said Gerald was always off on time and place. Certain specific things he just couldn't bring to mind as to what happened at a murder scene. So that's what happened with him. But Detective Mulholland, which is interesting, in 1983, 14 years after the murders, he gets a call that there was a junk dealer that was driving his truck 200 yards from the murder scene in 1969, a guy named Robert DeMore. And DeMore says he sees a guy duck into the woods the morning of the murders. And Detective Mulholland says, "Why the hell didn't you tell me this 14 years ago? You're telling me now?" He's like, drives down to his house and in rural Atlantic County, New Jersey, lays out 5 photographs and says, "Pick out the guy you saw." Says in 3 seconds he picked out Mark Thomas. So again, it's sort of, pretty interesting, huh?
Wow.
Yeah. So.
And then, so you've got the half print of a fingerprint from someone else that matches. You've got Mark Thomas, and you've got other potential leads as well. I mean, how does that all come about? I mean, that's just so, yeah.
But what's so bizarre about this was always fascinating me about this case. If you look back in the Farmer's Almanac, sunrise was at 5:29 a.m. According to the coroner's report, these girls were murdered at between 6:15 and 6:30. It was bright daylight. You know how light it is early in the morning? It was bright daylight. So whoever did this, whether it was a hitchhiker at the circle or whether it was someone who the car pulled them over to the side of the road, gets 2 girls to walk into the woods, murders them, okay, strips one of them. One of them had a bra tied into her hair, which is a fascinating thing. And I didn't mention this to you earlier, while another car with 3 boys was sleeping 50 yards away or 100 yards away from the girl's car. The boys pulled over in a Mustang, passed out, ran out of gas. They were coming from Wildwood, another party town. By the time they wake up, they see the girl's car there. They walk past it. No one's in there. They don't think anything of it. They get gas. They hitchhike. They come back. It wasn't until a few days later that they realized that this car was connected with a murder. So these 3 boys come down. They all pass lie detector tests. They didn't hear any screams from the woods while they're in the car. Now, how strange is that? Wouldn't you think 2 girls being murdered 50 yards, 100 yards from you, you would hear that? Not only that, but that whoever pulls them over with that car in plain sight, takes the girls in, kills them, and then leaves. Why does he, if his intent is to do this, why does he do it with another car parked there, with assuming that the occupants were visibly in the car? But even if they weren't, it was in broad daylight. And one of the serial killer experts I talked to said he doesn't think it would be a serial killer because he said a serial killer would never want to get caught. That's his biggest fear. But still, the crime scene would suggest that it was a serial killer. And in the Garden State Parkway Murders, a cold case mystery, I just go into all these different scenarios.
What did the cops think about the young guys that pulled up in that car? I mean, what was their feeling on
One
that?
of them, well, they said they had come from Wildwood. They had, again, pulled over to the side of the road. The newspaper said they ran out of gas. One of the detectives I spoke with said that was complete BS. He said they were too drunk to drive. Back then, you could pull over and sleep on the side of the parkway, and the cops didn't bother you. And they said they went to sleep, and by the time they woke up, they said the car was there, and they didn't put 2 and 2 together until days later, nor did they know that the girls were 200 feet into the woods away from them at that time. This took place while they were sleeping. 2 girls were murdered, and I want to say staged by the murderer. And all of this stuff happened, he did while they were there in broad daylight on the side of a highway.
Well, unless the murder happened somewhere else and the car was parked up there and the bodies were moved there.
It couldn't. It just
no.
The way the police had surmised that the bodies weren't moved. They were killed there.
Wow, what an enigma.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, it's a difficult case, isn't it? I mean, I can see why it's taking you so long just to get the book done, just to cover every single angle. And as you say, you've spoken to serial killer profilers, and So if it wasn't, does any of the ones that we've talked about so far match someone that was not a serial killer in a sense? I guess Mark could have gone into that category.
Mark wasn't, nor was Ronnie Walden. It was really Gerald, Stano, and Ted Bundy. There were other. I mean, at the end of the Garden State Parkway Murders, I give these mini biographies of. There were myriad serial killers in the area at the time. They just weren't heavily reported because no one really came up with that definition. It didn't really get into the whole public discussion until Silence of the Lambs and so forth. But there were many of them, and they called the Times called 1974, the golden year of serial killers because so many of them were out there, and that's when Bundy's alleged first murders took place. But you had a guy named Robert Zarinski who in 2016 DNA was matched to him, and he killed a woman on the side of the parkway or left her body there. He was from North Jersey. He died in prison, but he was connected with a lot of unsolved murders. So he's still a viable suspect. Say suspect, a person of interest that should be looked into. You had a guy named Eugene Claussen in West Virginia. There were these 1970 murders where these girls were beheaded. He was interviewed by the New Jersey State Police. It's so many of these guys, but the thing is this, where this took place contributed to it being what I call a perfect murder. It was a weekend, and I guess no one's really paying attention to it. It was just constantly crowded. You had a lot of all-night bars there. So I've always felt whoever did this was out all night drinking. Now I don't know if you've ever been out up all night partying. It's not a good feeling when 6 a.m. when you haven't slept. And you imagine someone who's psychologically unbalanced combined with that feeling. And for whatever reason, he could be an incel. He could have been a Vietnam veteran who'd come back with PTSD. You think about, I think the sleeplessness really triggered or heavily contributed to what he did that morning. But at the same time, it wasn't a spontaneous act to the extent that he was angered. He obviously had done something like this before, because you just don't do something that professionally and have that kind of moxie and then just take off again with the other car being there.
No, well, absolutely. And you kind of touched on it, other murders that were in the area just before this one and after. Were there any others that were sort of similar to this one?
Next year in 1970, there was in Wildwood, New Jersey, the same town where those boys had been, a woman was found murdered under the boardwalk there, a big amusement park there in Wildwood. And she had sand stuffed into her mouth, had been garroted with an electric wire. And I recently found out, not recently, I shouldn't say that, but I did talk to one of the detectives. This was kept out of the paper, that a bow was wrapped around her private areas. So again, a staging of sorts, or a signature, if you will, something that didn't need to be done, almost to taunt investigators. But they were never, the state police did try to draw a connection, but they were never able to. In North Jersey, along the Parkway, and again, in the 70s, there were a lot of murders. I always suspected there could have been a serial killer, a guy named Richard Cottingham, has begun to confess to a lot of them. He was around in the area, but nothing with these precise set of circumstances, that were at the off of 31.9 of the Garden State Parkway.
No, thank you for that. Now, just mentioning the name Richard Cunning again, I think we've mentioned him. You two were writing to each other, is that right?
Richard Cottingham.
Sorry.
Cottingham, yeah. In 2010, I wrote him, and I wrote another person that the police were interested in, John Norman Collins, who was the co-ed killer of Michigan. He killed like 7 co-eds in Ann Arbor. There were extreme similarities between the murders in Michigan and the murders in the Jersey Shore. So the state police compared notes, but were never able to pin him to it. But Cottingham, I wrote to him on a lark and said, let me try this. Never done this before. I just sent out a letter, sent it to the New Jersey State Prison. A couple months later, I get a letter from him saying, first of all, I know you're writing about these girls, and in order for me to talk to you, I'm going to need a $250 food package sent to my cell, and I also need, if you come here, I need to give you $1. And with respect to the food package, he said, I know, that's why I know you're not a cop, because a cop would be too cheap to spend $250 on a food package. I was saying, I'm too cheap to spend that on a food package for you. And the other point is, you're talking to a lawyer. If you give me if you give me $1, Now it's attorney-client. So I couldn't divulge whatever you told me anyway. And I'm writing a book. So what would be the point, Richard? You're so smart for me to do this. He just said if we did meet, he would tell me the type of person that would do something like this. But that's as far as we got, as far as our conversation. But he went ahead and he's talked to a lot of serial killer experts who have met with him since that time. So I don't know.
Yeah. It's interesting running to some of these people that have been in for how long? I mean, he's probably been in what, 20 years maybe, or
Yeah,
Richard?
more than that.
More than that,
More
probably.
than that.
Yeah. They get so institutionalized, and I think they want to tell their story in one sense, right? Because they want to talk to someone. It's a change of scenery, but that is different with the food package. It's like recently I wrote to the BTK serial killer, and he wrote me back, and we're in kind of early talks right
really?
now. Yeah, we're in early talks, but I mean, he was like, Kevin, I've retired from the BTK. And I was like, that's so odd to say that. Do you know what I mean?
He thinks he's a celebrity.
Yeah.
He thinks he's a celebrity.
Yeah. I've retired from it. I mean, it made me laugh to begin with. I mean, not laughing at the crimes he did. I mean, they were bloody horrendous. Do you know what I mean? But just didn't expect someone to say that. Do you know what I mean? And he puts his little lovely symbols on there as well. The psychological aspect of these people it's incredible. And I think even some people that have been in for so long, maybe 30 to 40 years plus, right, even though they've done their time, right, maybe, right, they don't want to leave. Some part of them does not want to go back into normal society. I'm sure it's, they get so... I don't know. It's but what do we do with them? I mean, if they're not safe to be with the general public, what do you do? If we didn't have this system, where would we be? Even though the system doesn't always work, right? And there are corruptions in it. But I mean, Christ, what else would we have? But I mean, it's so annoying, isn't it? When it must be so annoying for the detectives, like they just couldn't solve this bloody crime.
And one of the detectives said, and it was a great line. He said, I know half of the detectives I spoke with would give a piece of their pension, to give, and that's a substantial pension in New Jersey for state police to solve this case. You can hear the anguish. I met a guy, interviewed him about 2 years ago. I frankly don't know whether he's still with us. He was in bad shape. He was 90, and I had been talking to him for the past several years. I'd spoken with him over a dozen times at length. He was one of the two detectives that were really involved. Several detectives were involved, but he was the chief polygraph guy named George Dix. And I met with him at age 90 down at his place, his senior living center, and mic'd him up, and we're talking, and you could see in his eyes this was still so important to this man. And he had retired, 40 years earlier. This case he could never let it go.
No, that's incredible. Well, that's incredible. You got that audio. If you still got it, that will be worth its weight in gold for other people to listen to one day in the future, I'm sure. Wow. Okay. Well, maybe a future documentary for the book. Who knows, right?
Exactly.
Who knows? You don't know where. I mean, this is early days for this book to be out still, and I'm sure. I mean, have you been getting any sort of feedback from it in the sense of anyone that's sort of come to you yet with any information?
No, as far, you get the random Bundy sightings, some credible, some not. I interviewed in the Garden State Parkway Murders. I did interview a guy who said that he was at the Shore Memorial Hospital, a hop, skip, and a jump away from the Summers Point Circle, and saw Bundy there that night get a ride from a local security guard. He said he just remembers faces because he's an artist. So he was the most verifiable person who said saw Ted there that night. Unfortunately, no one has come up with a picture. And these people will tell the New Jersey State Police, I saw him, and basically the police are like, you have a picture? If you don't, there's just really not a whole heck of a lot they can do. It'd be interesting if one day they come up with a picture. Someone comes up with a picture of Ted down there. It doesn't necessarily mean he did it. I mean, by there, I mean Ocean City, but yeah.
Now, I know in this interview we haven't gone in complete chronological order. There's a lot more, obviously, that we've left out. There's a lot in the book, actually, and people, it's a great read. And I've seen some of the reviews on Amazon, and it's really great to read some of those reviews. So that's lovely. So, what would you say is an important message of this book?
The message is I've provided so much information to the police, and I would hope that they could contextualize what I've given them as opposed to what they have back then. I've offered them a lot of new information, such as the Stano Thomas connection. This is not to say, obviously, that Mark was involved, but maybe Mark knows something. Gerald obviously had the capacity to do this. So I'd like to see what I hope that investigators, if they read this book, what they're gathering from it is, Chris has put a whole bunch of new stuff that we didn't know about because he's investigated in such detail. I'd really like to see that whole aspect of it, that Pennsylvania connection, really get explored more. Because I don't know if we're ever going to find the DNA. It's 2020. We don't have it. Maybe someone will come forth after reading it. Maybe we'll get a deathbed confession. I don't know. But the big message is I'd like to see someone, I'd like to see detectives explore what I've given them in the Parkway Murders, the book, and compare it to what they have in their files.
Well, I'm sure if the murder victims could talk, they would be so appreciative of you bringing this story up to date in a way and to a new audience.
Thank you.
I'm sure they would. And I mean, that's kind of what you've done by doing this as well. And, I wish you all the success with this book and, passing it on to someone that can, or a team or whoever, like you've said, that will, maybe it will push him in a different direction to at least maybe close it. Do you know what I mean? In some respects. So, and, I feel like I've left a lot out, but I know we're restricted with an hour right now. We're almost there. And, are you working on anything else, or?
I'm in the very beginning stages of trying to, and I use this prefatory language, a podcast which would be limited to the Parkway Murders. I don't have any, harbor any illusions about going into a whole series, but I'd like to do a several-part series on that. But someone who's technologically as deficient as I am, that's going to be a project in and of itself. So I just trying to get, the word out and, Facebook, even since again, a lot of older folks are getting, really getting a lot of great feedback from them saying, I remember this, let's get this solved, hopefully get a groundswell of support. For this, the Sunrose Words and Music is the only independent or one of two independent bookstores left in Ocean City, New Jersey, where these girls stayed the last night. And the owners, Nancy Miller and Ross Schifflin, are selling my book. They have it out there. So nice. And they sold the last book. So they've been great. And obviously, I just want to say that it's available on Amazon, in paper and in Kindle. Things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're going to link the book in the description below to some of those sites as well. No, I think the podcast is a great idea. And, you've got so much other material associated with this case that never made it into the book, even if it's, whatever interviews that you've done, I'm sure people would love to have that mixed up in the podcast maybe as well. Yeah. So I think that's a good idea. Okay. Well, you're going to be busy for the foreseeable while with this. So, yeah, you know what, Chris, just thank you so much for coming on today. And the website for this book, we'll link it as the publisher website, I think. That's probably the best thing to do, yeah. So that's been coming up on the screen as well. So if you want a bit more information on Chris, just go to the website that's on the screen right now, and we'll link that in the description. So, Chris, thank you for today.
Thank you. I'm very blessed and grateful that you had me as a guest. I really genuinely say that, more people like you show an interest in the case. It gets out, the word gets out in public, and, maybe we can get some justice and some closure for Susan Davis and Elizabeth Perry.